Hello everybody. In the last video we went over some of the interface of Mudbox. For instance, we looked at the Layers tab as well as the Object list, which is the equivalent of the outliner in Maya, where we can see what we actually have in our scene. And we also spent quite a bit of time looking specifically at the Sculpt brush and its settings over here. And we briefly looked at the Erase tool and the Smooth tool. To very quickly review some of the material that we went over, you will remember that the W key will give you a wireframe view of your mesh. You can toggle it on and off. And you will typically want to use Shift D to up the resolution of your mesh so that you'll have enough geometry to sculpt and model. I'm bringing this up to level 5, which gives me almost 400,000 faces. Another thing that I recommended in the previous video was to work in layers because that will give you more functionality, it'll give you more flexibility as you do your sculpting. We looked extensively at the Sculpt tool, and you'll remember that it will pull geometry out. However, you can also change some of the settings over here. For instance, we can invert it, which will push the geometry in instead. In addition, we can also use the Control button on our keyboard to get the same effect. So when I use my brush stroke like that, it pulls the geometry out. When I hold down the Control key, it pushes the geometry in. You also learned that you can change the size of your brush here. I can make it larger or smaller. In addition, I can use the B key on my keyboard to get the same effect. I hold down the B key, use the left mouse button, and I can interactively adjust the size of my brush. I can also adjust the strength of my brush here. If I make the brush weaker, I'll get this effect. If I make it stronger, I'll get this effect. And once again, there's a hotkey for this functionality, and it is the M key on your keyboard. And if I use my left mouse button, you'll see interactively how I can adjust the strength of this brush. A couple other things that we looked at were the stamp spacing, which is found here. And if I increase the stamp spacing and increase the strength of my brush, I'll get this. If I decrease the stamp spacing, the stamps will be closer together, closer, and if we keep that distance very small, the stroke will look much more smooth. We also looked at the fall off here and the different fall off settings which can be found here, which will adjust the effect of our brush. The default has a very soft peak as well as a soft base. But if we try some of these other fall offs, we get a different effect. For instance, this one has a sharp peak but a soft base, and this one does exactly the opposite, where it has a very soft peak but a sharp base. You can play around with these different fall-offs, but you can also adjust and create your own fall-offs. 3. I'm going to set this back to something a little more like the default behavior there. Another thing that we looked at, I'm going to press W so that we're not seeing the wireframe on here any longer, is that you can hide and unhide your layers. That's one of the strengths of working with layers. You can also decrease the strength of your layer or increase the strength of your layer. And in addition, you can create new layers. I'm going to hide this layer and I'm going to create a new layer. Now remember that the layers are actually associated with the resolution that you're currently working in. And what I'm working in now is my highest resolution. We'll take a look at that again in just a moment. Now that I'm in a new layer and I've hidden my original layer here, we'll take also a very quick look and review at the mirroring. Currently it is off, but if I turn on the X mirroring, you can actually see the axis that it is going to mirror it on, or the Y axis, or the Z axis, for example. We'll try the X axis. And with mirroring on, whatever I do on one side will happen on the other side as well. You can explore some of the other mirroring as well. Another thing that we looked a lot at in the previous video were how to work with layers, and it's very crucial to understand how to work with them to use Mudbox effectively. So I'm going to activate once again my other layer. So now I have these two layers on top of one another. You see I have this layer here and this layer here. Currently I have my layer 2 selected, and what I'm going to do is enable my erase tool. I'll make my brush a little bigger by using the B key, and I'll erase. And you can see that in fact when I erase, it only erases what is actually in the layer that I currently have selected. You can see that I can't erase these strokes here because they are not on this layer. If I want to erase these strokes as well, I would need to select that layer, and then I could erase the sculpting that's on that layer as well. And the other thing that's very important to understand when working with these layers, notice that here there's the number 5 and the number 5, meaning that these layers are associated with my level 5 of this mesh. And you'll remember from the previous video that you can use the page up and the page down keys on your keyboard. By doing page down, I'll go to my lower levels, level 4, level 3, level 2, level 1, and so on. In fact, I can go all the way down to level 0 here, where I have only 384 polygons. If I want to go back up to my other levels, I simply use the page up key. But notice that when I'm on layer 4, I cannot work in either of these layers. We have this little icon here indicating that I cannot sculpt on that layer right now. If I want to do any sculpting on level 4, which is what I'm at now, I need to create another layer for it. And now I can sculpt on that layer. Currently I have my erase tool selected. Let me select my sculpt tool, and as you can see, I can sculpt. I still have mirroring on. Remember, when you don't want to mirror any longer, make sure to turn it off. So now I have a third layer. I can hide, unhide it. I can use that layer when I'm on level 4 of my mesh. But if I do the page up and go to level 5, I can no longer work on level 4. However, I can work on either of these two layers. The other way, besides using page up or page down to cycle through your layers, would be to come over here to Mesh, where you can step up, or you can step the level up, or you can step the level down. Here you also see the hotkeys of page up and page down. Before wrapping up this quick review, I am going to go over to my object list. This shows me everything that is in my scene. So I have 4 cameras, I have a light, I have a default material, and I have my sphere. And if I click on this plus symbol here, you will see all the different levels of my mesh. And in fact, this is one of the very powerful features of Mudbox, is that you're able to work on a single model but at different levels. Sometimes it's going to be easier to work on your model at a lower level, and sometimes when you need fine details, it's going to be easier and better to work at a higher level. Now, my reason for doing this very quick review is because in today's video, we're going to be taking a look at the rest of the sculpt tools here. But what you should understand is that when you know how to use the sculpt tool here, these other brushes work very similarly. Now, as I go over these different tools, I'm actually not going to go through them in the order that they appear. It'll be a little bit easier to understand perhaps if I group them according to their similar functions. And what I'm going to do first is start a new scene. I won't save this. And once again, I will use a sphere for this demonstration. I pressed W so that I could see the wireframe here. I'm going to return to my Layers tab here. And I'm going to up the resolution of the mesh so that I can more effectively sculpt on it by holding down Shift D. 1, 2, 3, 4. We'll go all the way up to level 6 so that it is more than 1,500,000 faces. Quite a lot of faces, but that's one of the strengths of Mudbox, is that you're able to work with very high resolution meshes. I don't recommend using more than what you actually need, but because of the versatility of being able to page up and page down on your mesh to the different levels, you're able to work with very high resolution meshes. And you can see my wireframe here, and you can see how high resolution this mesh is. I'll press W to hide that wireframe, and we'll start taking a look at some of these other tools. Now, you'll remember from the previous video that I showed you that if you put your mouse over the tool itself, it'll tell you what the tool does. The Sculpt tool lifts the surface as you stroke over it. We're going to take a look at a couple other tools that work very similarly. I won't go in depth with them because basically if you understand the Sculpt tool, you'll understand these other tools as well. So another tool that is very similar to the Sculpt tool would be the Foamy tool, found here. And if I put my mouse over it, you'll see that it says the Foamy tool is intended for initial shape forming rather than for creating fine detail. It is similar to the Sculpt tool, but has a softer feel. And that's really all you need to understand about this tool. It is the exact same tool as the Sculpt tool, with the key difference that it is a little bit of a softer effect. That's it, really. So one thing I should quickly remind you is please do remember to work in layers, because that's going to give you more. It's easy to forget, very easy. I forget it oftentimes. I forget to create layers. But if you remember to make a layer before you actually start sculpting, your results will be much better. You'll have a much easier time working with it. So I currently have the Foamy tool selected now, and as you can see, it works very similarly to the Sculpt tool. And in fact, all these different settings here are going to be the same as the Sculpt tool. And once again, you can use the B key and the M key to adjust the brush's width as well as its strength. Another tool that is very similar to the Sculpt tool, but is actually, I think, a quite nice brush here, is the wax brush. Again, I won't go into it in too much depth because it works like the Sculpt tool, but the wax tool builds up the surface similar to the way adding clay or wax to a sculpture would. So let's select that, and you'll notice it works very similarly to the Sculpt tool, perhaps with just a little bit more of a flattened, a less rounded appearance. Otherwise, it works identically to the Sculpt tool and the Foamy tool. Now, one thing to understand about Mudbox when you're working with it is that when it looks like we're adding, as the tool suggests, that we're adding material to the mesh. But remember that you are in fact not adding any additional faces or geometry to a mesh when you're sculpting. You're in fact just pushing and pulling the material that is already there. Now, don't forget that because the wax tool does work more or less identically to the Sculpt tool, that all those different settings that we looked at before, such as inverting, will also work. You can push the geometry in rather than pulling it out. Remember, you can also use your hotkeys for that same effect. So here I am using the wax tool to pull geometry out, and if I hold down the Control key, it will push. It'll have the inverse effect. It'll push the geometry in instead. So we've looked at the Sculpt tool, we've looked at the Foamy tool and the wax tool. These three work very similarly to one another, but let's take a look at some tools that are a little bit different. And we will start with the knife tool. I will activate the knife tool, and as you can see, it creates what looks like a cut in the mesh. If I increase my brush size, I'll get a bigger or wider cut. If I decrease my brush size, it'll be a tighter cut. Of course, you can also adjust the strength, just like you can any of these other brushes. Don't forget, if you put your mouse over the tool itself, it'll say what it does. In this case, the knife tool cuts very fine strokes into a model surface. The tool has its own stamp image that should not be changed. Now, we'll talk about stamps in the next video. The next tool we'll look at will be the bulge tool, found here. And if we put the mouse on it, the description is that the bulge tool inflates the area under the brush by pushing each vertex out along its own normal. So that's a little bit different than the Sculpt tool that pushes everything or pulls everything out or pushes it in depending on your setting. This one will do something similar, however, it brings the geometry out according to the face's normal. So in other words, the direction that the face itself is pointing in. So let's take a look at what we can do with that. I'll make my brush a little bigger, and you can see it looks very similar. But actually there is a subtle difference. If we were to look at these faces here, each of these individual faces, if you imagined the direction that the face is pointing in, that's the direction that it's pulling the geometry out on. And that is the bulge tool. And also, we'll take a look at the grab tool. found here. Now this isn't the best mesh to illustrate this with, but we'll take a look at it. The grab tool grabs a single point on the surface and allows you to pull it in any direction. So, as an example, I'll activate the grab tool. If I put my mouse here, or maybe here, more towards the edge of it, and I pull it out, you'll see how easy it is to really adjust the shape of your geometry, the form. If I make my brush bigger, I'll get a bigger effect. If I make it smaller, I'll get a smaller effect. In fact, this will look a little messy. You can see how I pulled it out there. But that is the grab tool. To better illustrate the grab tool, perhaps we should look at a different mesh. I think a different mesh would illustrate the power of the grab tool a little bit better. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start a new scene, and we will use this human body. Now again, I'm going to increase the resolution at least a couple levels, and let's take a look at this grab tool. Very powerful tool, a very great tool for really making quick, big changes to your models. So I currently have the grab tool activated. I'm going to make my brush bigger. Oftentimes when I use the grab tool, if I want to make big changes to something, I'll use a large brush here. And you can see that I can really adjust the mesh and make large changes very, very quickly. Now, as I've said before, use layers, and that's something I forgot to do. I forgot to create a layer here. This means that if I want to erase this change, I'm not going to be able to. So I'm going to undo that, and I'm going to create a layer. The other thing I think I'll do with this grab tool is turn on mirroring. So now, if I make changes to one side, it'll make the appropriate change to the other side of the mesh as well. Now remember that you can adjust the size of your brush depending on the effect that you need. I'm going to give this guy little short stubby legs by increasing the size of this brush, and there we go. This is one of the power, I'd say, what makes the grab brush or sculpting tool so powerful is you can see how very, very quickly I was able to adjust this mesh and make it into something very different than what I began with. And because it's on a layer, I can deactivate that layer or reactivate it. I can adjust its strength. Or if I need to, I can erase the effect. So this video is getting quite long. I think I'm going to break this up into two videos where I'll cover some of these other sculpting tools found here. But the tools that we've looked at today are the Sculpt tool, Grab, Foamy, Wax, the Knife tool, the Bulge tool, and we spent a little time using the Erase tool as well. I hope that this video was informative and interesting for you, and I'll see you next time.